All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Eisenberg, and I'm just very pleased to be here today and have this opportunity to share with you all a little bit about the work that we're doing on a new router for AngularJS. Before I jump into the details of that, I want to just share a bit about myself and the history of this particular part of the project. As I said, my name is Rob Eisenberg. I've been building client-side libraries similar to AngularJS for almost 9 years now across a variety of platforms, various Windows platforms, some work with Unity 3D, and I'm well known in the web community for my work on Untitled.js. And earlier this year, I got connected with Brad, and we were talking about what Angular was going to be doing and what I was planning to do. And he said, hey, why don't you come join us and let's work together on this. So I started working with the Angular team back in February of this year. And one of the first things I had the opportunity to provide a lot of feedback on and to begin implementing was a new router. So I'm going to be sharing that with you today. Now, Brian Ford, who's right here, had begun a process of actually reaching out to the community, looking at a lot of different routers, UI router, our existing router, routers from other frameworks like Ember and Durandal, Sammy.js. There's a lot of different client-side routers out there. And aggregating all this information into a document that sort of showed the breadth of features, the different use case scenarios that were out there. And we invited the community to give us feedback. And over a period of several months, we kind of gained a vision of what a new router needed to be able to do for AngularJS 2.0. Now, I then went and did some implementation. We did a couple iterations on it. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that today and talk about that. But after we did that, and I think this will be really important for a lot of you, we discovered, hey, we can actually port this to Angular 1.3. So depending on what you're kind of looking forward to, if you're looking for Angular 2.0, or if you're looking for something new for Angular 1.3, you can frame this presentation in either of those contexts because you're going to see this router appear for both libraries in the future. So let us move on. So this talk is pretty quick. It's only 20 minutes or so, but it's split into two parts. We'll spend most of the time talking about some high-level features of the new router, and then we'll end the talk with a discussion of the actual design of this router. And I think as we get there, you're going to see how that's actually going to be very important for you as the developers building on top of it in the future. So let's begin with features. Let's start with the basics. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but I want to make sure I cover all the bases. This router has the features you would probably expect of any router. So let's just start there. You can configure static routes. You can configure parameterized routes. You can do splat routes. You can do query strings. You can handle not found routes, all these sorts of things. History manipulation, right? Forwards and back, injecting into the history while not changing controllers, changing controllers while not changing history, all the sort of baseline features that you may have seen in any router that you've looked at. So, of course, we've got that covered. We also have some basic features that are a little bit new to you. Perhaps you may have seen some things like these in other routers, but I think for the Angular community, a few of these things will be a bit new. So the first is conventions. The new router will actually, for basic scenarios, requires no configuration whatsoever. You can just drop it in there, and it will start allowing you to navigate to controllers just by basic conventions. Now, that doesn't work for a lot of real-world apps, but what is nice is to be able to sort of layer conventions and tell the router only what you really want to tell it and let it figure out the rest, so you don't end up typing and repeating yourself over and over in multiple places. So the conventions are kind of layered and let you use as much of that or as little of that as you want when you're configuring the router. We also have something that's nice. It's called a navigation model. Typically, when you configure a router, you want to somewhere maybe display a menu or a sidebar, a set of tabs that represent the UI for the user to interact and navigate through the app. So we actually let you mark your routes as certain parts of them as being navigable, and we will actually build up a special model for you which you can then ng repeat over to generate any kind of UI you want. We'll make sure that we keep all the hrefs up to date. We'll make sure that we mark it as active if the current route matches the model, so you can highlight menus and all these sorts of things. So you get that kind of for free. And then there's a bunch of other small little features like updating the document title and hash change and push date, all the kind of things that you would probably expect. So I think hopefully we've covered the basics. There's a lot there even than that, but it's the basics. It's not the most interesting. So let's move on to some really new things that I think you'll be excited about. Some of these things you may have seen in other routers. Some of these things you may have been asking for a while. So let's get into the good stuff. The first feature is dynamic loading. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this because it speaks for itself. So the ability to load controllers on the fly. The larger your app gets, you may get into a problem where you don't want to or can't bundle up the entire app for an initial download to the person that's using the app. And oftentimes you'll want to load things on the fly based on what the user is doing, where they're navigating to. So this is traditionally very hard with the existing router. You've got routers like UI Router that help to solve this problem. We've looked at them and learned from them and learned from a number of other routers that actually enable this. And so by default, the new router is going to fully supports dynamic loading. In fact, all the demos I'm going to show you today, everything is dynamically loaded in these particular demos. So let's move on to something completely new. We have added a feature that we call child apps. As your application grows, it becomes hard to manage the teams or the individual features. And so we have the ability now to have more than one router in a single application. So you actually have your typical app level router, but now you can actually have routers per controller that have child routes that control navigation within the state of that controller. And you can actually nest these in levels deep, right? So you can now imagine, let's say that we have multiple teams working on an app or multiple developers working on an app, and we have a whole feature area that has its own set of routes, its own set of controllers and views. You can now hand that off to a developer or a team, and they can actually own their own router. Then you can take that feature and drop it into your app, and it just works. We automatically hook up the relative URLs. URL generation works correctly. We understand the state of the app, and so on and so forth. So this is a very powerful feature. Especially, it's very necessary for these very large-scale apps. But even if you're a one-man shop, this lets you more discreetly box off individual features, and it lets you have encapsulation of larger feature areas of your app. Another great thing about this is typically in an Angular app, you're used to writing controllers, and this is kind of a very granular way of breaking down your apps. But child routers actually lets you have a larger distributable piece of your application. So you can imagine maybe somebody in the community that just comes up with a really awesome solution for user management, and it's got its own set of views and controllers and all the functionality around creating users, managing their roles and permissions and so on and so forth. Well, they can now use a child router to configure all the routes and set everything up and then publish this on GitHub. And if you want to use that in your app, all you would have to do is download it, drop it in the folder, and point the app router at the main controller for that feature, and it all just plugs in and works. So this is a really powerful, larger building block that you can use. Hopefully the community will be able to use it to build some amazing things. But even on teams, when you have multiple teams, multiple developers, it lets you break things down and encapsulate larger pieces of your app very nicely. Of course, as a side effect of this, we can actually manage the state of your app much more because now we know a lot more about the structure of your app at runtime. So by using these child routers, we hook up things and we understand exactly how the state transitions are happening. We know that, oh, this state goes to this state. Well, we don't need to change any of this other stuff. It's only this one little piece that's changing. So we can understand a lot more about the state of your app. We can understand how to reuse components so we don't have to regenerate templates and so on and so forth in certain scenarios. So it lets us actually be more efficient as well. So this is a really powerful feature. You may have seen this in other routers, maybe called nested routers or child routers. So we think of it as child routers. You can even think of it as child apps because you can actually take an entire app and then drop it inside of another app now and just map it, and the whole thing will work. So this is very powerful. In addition to this, we have something called parallel controllers, which lets you map a single route to multiple controllers. So not only do you have this nested structure that you can create, but you can also have multiple views side by side for a single route. So you can think of your app as being this tree structure that's generated dynamically at runtime. So this gives you lots of flexibility in terms of how you're organizing your app, how you're building your app, and it gives us lots of information that we can use to sort of optimize things that are happening at runtime. So this is really cool. Let's look at a demo real quick, just to try and make this a bit more concrete. All right, so here we have just a simple hello world type app with, you can see there's a navigation at the top. It says home, Flickr, and settings. So there's 3 routes set up. And if I navigate to the settings, you can think of settings as its own little miniature app. Sometimes if you have large app, you have a whole settings area with different tabs and all kinds of different routes maybe involved just in settings. So if I navigate to settings, this settings controller is actually using a child router. And you can see here that it actually builds up its own sub-navigation. Interestingly, it maps the same exact 3 controllers that the top level does. So this is a little bit crazy. You would never do this, probably. But I want to demonstrate just how powerful and how dynamic these routes go. So you see, this is actually like a recursive scenario because each controller has its own instance of the router and maps its own routes relatively. So we can keep digging in and dynamically generating the state at runtime. And everything works correctly because it's all sort of linked back together and all the routes, all the URLs are generated, and it really just works. That controller for settings was not designed to be used this way, but it's just a side effect of the design of the router that you can have this whole piece that's encapsulated. And you can just drop it in wherever you want into your app and just map it in. So let's look at another quick example. Over here we have a basic issue tracker for Angular issues with a list of issues pulled from GitHub. And if we dig into one of these, let's see if it does or does not happen. Oh, it did. Great. So we dig into the detail of a particular issue. And what's cool here is this also has a child router, and that child router is used to generate the tabs. So each one of those tabs has its own controller and its own view. Each tab is essentially completely encapsulated and just drops into this detail screen. And of course, everything works in terms of navigating, and you can see the URLs changing. So it basically lets you break down your apps into these different pieces and just drop them in wherever you want. Now you may notice I'm not showing you any code, so I know that's the first thing you're thinking of. These demos are actually running against a old prototype of Angular 2.0 templating. So if I show you that, it's really not going to be representative of what's happening with Angular 2.0 today, so you'll get to see more of that tomorrow. And the port is not finished to Angular 1.3 yet, so I can't really show you that. So I know that you're thinking, where's the code? It is real, and these demos are real, but you'll have to wait just a little bit to see what the code looks like. Wavy magic hands. All right? So child apps, really, really powerful. A lot of things you can do with them. Makes it simple to do things that were rather difficult to do before. Screen activation. This is another big feature of the new router. Imagine you have somebody that's editing some data, and they go to navigate to a new screen. This is a typical scenario in almost any kind of data-driven app. But you typically want to, in the middle of navigation, say, whoa, wait, you have unsaved data. Are you sure you want to do that? So this can be a little bit tricky. So what we've done is we've created an explicit lifecycle to how navigation happens within an app. And any controller that's participating in navigation can opt into this lifecycle and use these hooks to control navigation when it's in process. So the lifecycle basically has, imagine that you're navigating to a controller. Well, you can opt into the can activate hook, and you can return true or false to allow or disallow navigating to that new controller. If activation is successful, you'll get called back with an activate hook, so you can do things when you actually display on the screen. Now imagine you're navigating away from a controller. You can utilize the can deactivate hook to return true or false to stop navigation or to permit navigation away from a controller. And of course, if you do navigate away, you can use the deactivate hook to execute cleanup code or whatever you need to. Now, the really cool thing about this is that you can actually return promises from all these hooks as well. So you can go off and do asynchronous operations in the middle of the navigation process. For example, you might need to go out to the database and ask the database some questions about user permissions or roles in a canActivate hook. And if the database says, no, this person can't actually do this, you might want to return false. So in the middle of the navigation lifecycle, you can do asynchronous operations, showing modal dialogues, calling out to services, whatever you need to do. Additionally, so as I mentioned, everything's promise-based. Additionally, you can return navigation commands. And these are custom objects you can return from these callbacks that let you take low-level control of the router itself in the middle of the process. A common example of this is redirects. So in that user scenario that I just mentioned where they don't have their permissions, you probably don't just want to cancel out the navigation. What you probably want to do is maybe something like a redirect to a different view that explains to them that they don't have rights to this, that, or the other. So redirect is actually implemented as a custom navigation command. You can write your own navigation commands to take control of the router mid-process as well. Again, you can return those directly, or you can return a promise for a navigation command. So you can build them up asynchronously. Let's look at a quick demo of the lifecycle. So here I've got this second tab open with a bunch of Flickr images related to Angular. You might see some people you recognize, maybe not, I don't know. I see some. And what I've actually done is on this controller for Flickr, I have implemented a canDeactivate hook that basically, if you watch as I navigate away, in the middle of the navigation process, it will ask me, are you sure you want to do that? And if I cancel, the URL history is hooked back up to where you're actually at. Or if I say OK, then it will move on to the other route. Now, what this gets really cool is that it works seamlessly with child routers. So I can actually come into a deep hierarchy. Say I come all the way in here. And let's see, it may not even load the... There we go. Right, and then somewhere up in the hierarchy, I change something, right? It still knows that that Flickr screen needs to be deactivated, or needs to opt into this part of the navigation lifecycle to permit this. So you can think of this as transactional screen transitions, where every controller can optionally plug into this transition process and cast a vote, so to speak, on whether this transition can happen. So of course, if I do say OK, then it will just navigate at that level like that. Let me show you one other example. This is a wizard example with 1, 2, 3 steps, right? And this is where sometimes you might want to use the canActivate hook. For example, you don't want them to go to step 2 until they've completed step 1. Now, you may think that it's sufficient to just add some validation logic to step 1 to make sure they've input the data. But with a browser, that's not really how users always interact with your app. They might come directly to step 2 just by typing it in. And you actually don't want them to do that. You might want to redirect back to step 1 so they start the process over. And so you can see if I actually go to step 1 and I type things in, and then I go next to step 2. Now, if I refresh the browser here, it's actually going to redirect me back to step 1. And that's using a custom redirect navigation command that's returned from that lifecycle hook. So the hooks are there for you to opt into and use if you want to or not. They're very powerful, and it allows each controller in your app to opt into this navigation process and take control of things. All right. We're going to end by a little bit of talk of the design of the router. And I want to make an important point here that with a router, design is a feature. We've been thinking very, very carefully about how the router itself is built, because we know that there are just so many different scenarios that you have that we can't even account for in terms of routing. Everybody has an opinion about routing. Every app is a little bit different. And what is really frustrating is when you have a library or something like a router, and it gets you 80% there, and that last 10 or 20% doesn't do it for you, and you have to tear the whole thing apart and start over if you have to dump it or go for another library. So this is real frustrating. So we're trying to design the router in such a way that you have key seams or pluggability points in the router that you can go customize its behavior. We've talked a little bit about some of those. The first I want to talk about is a key architectural design of the router, which is the navigation pipeline. So internally, the entire router is a pipeline architecture. There's a queue of navigation requests. We pull those requests off the queue. We generate a navigation instruction, which describes what is being requested. We have access to the previous instruction we process. We bundle those up into a context object, and then we push them through an asynchronous pipeline filled with multiple steps. And that's how the route is processed. I talked about the activation lifecycle for screens. That's actually modeled as 4 steps, 4 discrete steps within the pipeline. So if you don't like that, pull it out. You can write your own steps and plug them into the navigation pipeline. Some really cool things you can do with this. Again, talking about users, authentication and authorization. You can write a custom step in here that goes out to the database, authenticates the user, checks their roles and permission, and then decides what to do with them. So you can plug that into the pipeline, and you've got that functionality across all of your navigation requests. So you can extract that kind of logic out of your controller, which is really nice. Let you encapsulate that in one place. It's much easier to test, and so on and so forth. Another scenario that you might think of is, imagine you have a highly data-driven app, and somebody navigates to, say, person, whack 3, whack edit, right? And maybe this URL structure is the same across your entire app. Well, you can write a navigation pipeline step that recognizes this pattern, drop it in, and asynchronously in the middle of the pipeline, hit your database and preload that data, and then push it into the controllers for you. So you can extract all that kind of boilerplate logic out of your controllers, making your controllers much thinner and simpler and more focused on the task at hand. And I'm sure that the community will come up with lots of interesting things that they can do with this. But again, it's a pipeline architecture. The steps are completely asynchronous, and you have access to all the contextual information around the request. And you can customize that to achieve all kinds of really cool things. But there's a lot of other customization points. The configuration of the router under the hood is just a simple JSON data structure. And so we have built and are continuing to rev on an API for doing that. But the model for configuration is separate from the API for configuration. So it means if you want, you can build your own set of conventions on top of our data model or write your own configuration API. We talked about navigation instructions and navigation commands as key extensibility points of the router pipeline. Navigation commands you can plug into your controllers and control on a per controller basis how navigation is happening. We talked about pipelines already and the ability to pull out steps that you don't like or plug in your own steps. There's a couple of other things we didn't talk about yet around customization. History, because this is all built on dependency injection, history has been very carefully encapsulated into its own class. So if you want to build something like a Node WebKit app, for example, where it's not going to be running in the browser at all, you could implement history yourself, maybe over local storage, for example, and drop it in there, and the router will continue to work. And viewport is referring to the region of the actual view where we display your views for your controllers. And we have a very well-defined interface between the router and the viewport. So if you need to do some interesting animations that we haven't accounted for, or if you need to do some optimizations around caching of views, or anything fancy about how DOM interaction happens, you can actually pull out our viewport and write your own directive and drop it in there, and the router can communicate with you and tell you what to display, and you can go do whatever you want with that. So we've tried to think of a lot of different ways that we could create these seams in the design that would give you these places where you could pull things out and push other things in or customize things according to your needs. What I found building apps is that really there are no two apps that are exactly alike, and there's always some sort of edge case or something unique about each individual app. So again, we don't want you to have to be able to tear down the whole world just for this one little thing that we didn't account for out of the box. So we're trying to design and have a bunch of key points that you can customize things to your needs. Now, hopefully the defaults will do just fine for you, but if not, it's nice to know, I think, that you have this available to you. All right, well, that's pretty much what I have to say. If you are passionate about routing, if you have some scenarios that you think are interesting, if you have some feature ideas, I hope you will find me or you will find Brian and talk to us during this event. this is a really good time. We've done a first pass implementation of this router, and this is a really excellent time for feedback on the implementation that we've put together. So we really covet your response and hope that you'll participate with us in making this a really awesome router. And again, thank you for having me here today, and enjoy the afternoon.